Hello, people. We are live.
Sure. We don't start until 5, right?
We don't
Arjun is
start the
back.
official panel until 5.
Videos to be on during the entire thing, right? We are presenting.
The WebEx
It'll
recording
spread
has
out
to be started.
differently.
Mayurakshi,
Yes,
that you can start maybe couple of minutes or maybe 5 minutes before.
the recorder, right?
Right.
Yes.
Start it 5 minutes before.
Okay.
Sure.
I'm sharing the link with everyone right now. Okay.
Okay.
Sure. Yes, we are live. I can see that in the YouTube channel.
Okay. Oh, nice. Keep a pen handy, isn't it?
I would request everyone when you are not speaking, just mute your mic. Hi, folks. If you've just joined us, you've joined us for our panel on towards an Indian decolonial of the postcolonial digital humanities. We'll be waiting for a few minutes to ensure that panel starts at 5. We'll be coming back on switching on our videos exactly at 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you.
It's okay not to have a separate microphone, right? It would be clear.
You are audible, Nirmala, so that should be fine.
So that should be fine.
So if you just joined us, this is the 30 panel on towards an Indian decolonial oblique postcolonial digital humanities. We'll be starting in exactly about 2 minutes. If you have questions for the panelists, you can put it in the live comments, and we'll be taking questions towards the end of the panel. For the time being, I would ask you to hold on, sit tight. Another 2 minutes, we'll be beginning the meeting and the panel. I hope I'm audible to all the panelists.
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Not trying to run away from the screen. I was just checking on another system where our live is working. So it's working. Do we have Arjun on the call as well? Could he switch on his video? Because we should be starting. I'll ask everyone to mute their microphones if you're not speaking. Then I'll ask each of the panelists. Right. So hello and welcome. If you're joining us on YouTube, welcome to the 30 channel on YouTube. And if this is the first time you're visiting us, please do subscribe, share, and spread the word. 30 is the Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations. And in our previous avatar, we were known as the Digital Humanities Alliance of India. And we organized the first DH conference in India in June 2018 at IIM Indore in collaboration with IIT Indore. Today, we have a wonderful group of people together with us, all of my faculty colleagues from across India who teach at various public and private institutions in the country. And there's a common connection between all of us. All of us are extremely invested in digital humanities, or what we understand to be digital humanities. That's something that we will talk about today. And we are all colleagues and members of 30. So we originally, this was an offline panel at Ottawa 2020 at DH2020. Unfortunately, due to the COVID crisis, that has been cancelled. So we decided to do a live virtual panel online. There were two allied panels consisting of about seven papers. But at this point of time, two of our colleagues, Dr. Padmini Ray Murray and Dr. Siddharth Chakraborty, could not join us today. But we have them in spirit with us, along with their scholarship. We'll keep going back to that. We today have a wonderful panel of five of my colleagues and actually six of my colleagues. And we'll be having five wonderful presentations. So for each of the presentations, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to ask them to take about 10 to 12 minutes to go ahead with their presentation and their spiel. And I'm going to announce the name of each paper and each panelist as we move on. So without further ado, I'm going to start off with the first paper today. Our first paper today is from Dr. Mayurakshi Chaudhuri and Dr. Chiranjoy Chattopadhyay. And I'm just quickly going to move over to my next screen so that I don't mistake their paper title. Right? And their paper title is "Do Postcolonial Intersections Matter? Critical Epistemological Approaches to Digital Humanities and Mobility Studies in India." Dr. Mayurakshi Chaudhuri is an assistant professor of sociology at IIT Jodhpur, the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. She's also the coordinator of the Digital Humanities program there. A very exciting beginning for us because it's starting out with an MSc in Digital Humanities and a PhD in Digital Humanities. Her co-presenter, Dr. Chiranjoy Chattopadhyay, is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Jodhpur as well, and is also the head of the Computer Science Institute. So I would invite them to share their very exciting topic, and I would request all other panelists for the time being to keep their microphones muted. The screen is yours, Dr. Chaudhuri and Dr. Chattopadhyay.
All right. Thank you very much, Dibyadyuti. Just wanted to check, am I audible and is my screen visible to everyone?
Yes, on both.
Okay, great. So without further ado, the title of our paper is Do Post-Colonial Intersections Matter? Critical Epistemological Approaches to DH and Mobility Studies in India. So my slideshow is not working. Okay. So the question that we are asking in terms of the post-colonial intersection is, how do we visualize the post-colonial epistemes of migrants in a given context? So I'm briefly going to go through the context and the questions that we are looking at, the theoretical framework, and then I will invite Chiranjoy to talk about the nature of data and the tools and techniques that we are employing in this project. So this is actually a work in progress, this project. And of course, as many of us identify with an understanding of DH, that the major questions are coming from the society, questions based on culture and identity, that those questions are actually enabled because of technology, and also those questions are answerable because of technology. So we kind of premise the understanding of DH on this idea. And of course, it's a huge network of collaboration and interaction between the web, the people, the subject matter experts, etc. So there are four broad questions that we are looking at in this project, starting with if the post-colonial inquiry would change with new visibilities in the future, particularly for a digital humanist, and how would these inquiries scale across these multiple geosocial scales as we understand them, and if these scales would inflect and are inflected by the various axes of differences. And finally, how these negotiations would inflect the post-colonial realities in India, for example. So the theoretical grounding of our work is based on something that is very, very popularly known as the mobility turn in scholarship. So around the early 2000, this mobility turn started with very popular geographers, Mimi Scheller and John Lurie, who talked about this huge umbrella that would encapsulate, that would talk about everything that is mobile. So people and objects crossing space and time would fall under this mobility turn paradigm. And over time, this analytical scale, this analytical lens has actually been more sophisticated, and an understanding has been improved with technology and transportation broadened the possibilities for people being mobile in the world, which means that mobility is a normal state for stable populations. So it is not really an exceptional thing for the human, the history of human civilization, but it's really a very normal state. And as we are talking about, mobility and movement and the normal and the new normal in this context, this becomes even more important to understand. So a wonderful way that they define is that from walking to electric flows, from driving to transportation to virtual mobility, from refuge to migration, from tourism to pilgrimage. So pretty much as you can see in this definition, everything or everyone who is mobile is actually falling under this umbrella of mobility. And it's a very, very helpful tool to understand. However, the question is migration. So the project that we're doing now is on migration. And the question is that the experience of every migrant is not really similar. And so when you actually put all the migrants under the same umbrella called mobility, the experience of each migrant gets kind of lost in that umbrella. So while we acknowledge that the mobility, the understanding of mobility as an analytical lens has traveled a huge and a very sophisticated distance since the 2000s, the idea of migration being nested under that umbrella is a little problematic because, for example, if you consider if you're migrating as a tourist, if you're migrating as a student versus if you're going somewhere as a tourist, or if you're migrating for work purposes, all of these experiences would be very different. And so we take it from there to understand how these experiences matter for migrants. And we talk about something called post-colonial intersections, where we look at this polyvocality, the multiplicity of histories, and we talk about these everyday negotiations that create these pressure points of movements for these migrants across geosocial scales, where we talk about gender, religion, age, social class, caste, just to name a few of them. So, and not surprisingly, this whole argument of mobilities cannot be completed without talking about its relationship with power and knowledge. So if we go back to the history of the scholarship, we see Professor Dodd's classic work on power geometries, where she talks about this idea of mobility that is equated with power, which we later pick up and build up on and what we call scaling intersectionality in a paper in 2015. And then we also see that that has been, again, improved, where we talk about mobility as a knowledge object rather than as an identified subject. Or, in other words, mobility is constituted not only by movement, but also by the meaning or ideological representations and by power, be it economic, symbolic, or political. So it is just problematizing the understanding of mobility, equating or relating it with the idea of power and knowledge. So we're coming back to the question that we are looking at in this project about migration as mobility. So while we acknowledge that putting migration under the umbrella of mobility, takes away from migration the experience factor, we also ask how can we conceptualize migration as a fruitful contribution to the field of mobility studies, and additionally, how can migration provide a nuanced lens for the existing debates in mobilities? And we've argued about this in another paper where we talk about this multi-scalar approach adopted to understand migration as a case of mobility, but not, engulfing it under the huge umbrella of mobility. So coming back to the question that we are working in this project, do post-colonial intersections matter? And visualizing that post-colonial epistemes for South Asian migrants, we are looking at 4 different types of data here. And we're looking at text-based data for oral histories. We're looking at social networks that is mostly graph-based. We're looking at migrants' experiences in terms of visual analytics, and we're looking at maps in context or visualizing maps. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and invite Chiranjoy to continue with the rest of the presentation. Chiranjoy, over to you.
Thank you, Mayurakshi. So let me start sharing my screen. Is it visible to everybody?
Yes.
Yeah. So as
Yes, indeed.
has said, so visualization has been there for a long time, as we all know. I mean, it's a way to kind of get into more insight into the data, which usually, plain text or tabular representation might not give us that insight. So if you go back to the work by Charles Menon on this visualization of the migrant data, here you will see that on a map, the flow has been shown using various type of colors, color coding, as well as the width, which indicates the amount of data in terms of the migrant going from one location of the world to the other. So it is there for a long time, and but it has not stopped at that point in time. People have come up with new tools and techniques to visualize data and to get more insight into the data. So in this particular project, we are trying to get into this sort of analytics through various type of visualizations. For textual data analytics here, you can see that this is a visualization of various sort of interviews which has been taken as a primary data. And this gives us a much more insight in terms of the relationship between various type of the data collected via interviews and their encoding and their relationship. But this is based on the textual data, as we are also looking at graphical data and visual analytics in terms of maps. Here is another way of representing the data. On the left-hand side of the screen, you will see the migration trends in the urban core and the peri-urban regions. Here we are showing the regions in terms of across a decade over a particular part of India, the eastern part of India. On the right-hand side, you will see the current contemporary COVID scenario. Based on that, the migration from a southern part of the country has been shown. So all these visualizations are from the Tableau public data repository. This is an example of that. This is just to give a context of what sort of analysis can be done. This data is not part of our project. When we are talking about the graphical analysis of the data, here we can see that on the left-hand side, there is again graphical networks where nodes and the edges of the graphs are shown here on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you will see there is a chord diagram which shows the relationship between the data in a matrix form. So here you see along the circular, along the arc, we can see the various type of data and their relationship across the various other data present in that same matrix. Because matrix has been a quite interesting way of representing the data. Now, using these sort of tools, we are planning to analyze and answer the bigger question, which Mayurakshi has said in the beginning, that the data related to migration and how this migration flows and the experience of a migrant across the country, as well as various other factors or variables that influences the entire paradigm of this migration as an entire concept, and try to answer the questions that we have raised, the four basic analysis through text, graph, visual analytics, as well as through graphical representation. We want to analyze the data and come up with a method and new algorithms to answer those questions. So with that, we end our presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dibyadyuti.
Thank you, Chiranjoy and Mayurakshi. Thank you also for keeping time. That was wonderful. The best part of being a moderator, or the worst part of being a moderator, is also managing time. So thank you so much. This is fascinating work. I have a lot of questions, especially connected to the initial trilateral or trialectic structure you talked about: society, research tools and methods, and collaborations. But I'll come back towards the end of all of the presentations. After they conclude, we'll come back with the questions, allow us for a richer dialogue. Thank you again for sharing your work. Our next speaker today is Dr. Arjun Ghosh, who's an associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Delhi. Dr. Ghosh, his presentation today is visualizing the cultural history of South Asia. And I believe there might be a slight issue with his visual or video right now, but I think if he's ready to go, I would transfer it over to him.
Thank you, Dibyadyuti. I hope there is no issue with my video. I can begin straight away. Is that okay? Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen.
Right. So, it's great that, Mayurakshi and Chiranjoy spoke about and outlined the issues surrounding migration, and that sort of makes my task a little easier. What I'm trying to do is, in my work, I'm trying to look at the migration by the who's who of the society, of the South Asian society, particularly of India, and try to see it sectorally by occupation, and the entertainment industry, politicians, academicians. How do they migrate? Because that gives us a map of the regional development within a certain country or a society. And for this, I use open data sources like Wikidata, and I use certain data analytics tools like Sparkle and R. And what happens traditionally, as Mayurakshi and you saw in Mayurakshi and Chiranjoy, mostly migration studies focus on migration of labor, or either white collar or blue collar. And they try to identify major centers for economic action. For example, here you see a kind of a visualization of train traffic and migration through train traffic raised by the economic survey, which is done annually under the budget, the Indian budget, right? There are two issues here. One is that of data opacity. That is, that increasingly we find that data from official sources are extremely opaque. We do not know how they are collected. There is also a reluctance to share data, And the second is that how do we use migration as a tool to study shifts in cultural and social behavior? And that's what I'm going to attempt to do here. And I take inspiration from a particular work by Maximilian Sketch and his colleagues, which was undertaken to network cultural history through birth and death records of notable individuals, well, Western, primarily Euro-American history, cultural history, over 2 millennia. I look at 2 centuries of within the Indian subcontinent. Primarily, as I said, through Wikipedia and Dibyadyuti, which are linked data sources. Now, just a moment about these linked data sources. What happens is that under each item has a unique resource identifier, and the subject has many statements under which there is a predicate and an object. And each of these objects then resolve into specific, within the resource description framework, resolves to items on their own order. And you can then pick up further statements down the line. Say here, you can, from the birthplace, you can pick up the coordinates and then use it for geospatial mapping. And that's and of course, these are open data sources, particularly Wikidata. They are open to public scrutiny. Things are constantly changing, even as we speak. So, because they are maintained and verified by the community, they are filtered by the community. But this is a certain level of filtration of data, because we figure out figures who are important in the society. Secondly, very importantly, these are granular data sources. You get multi-point data on each subject, and it can vary in depth according to the particular field of a person, right? So if you have a person's occupation, you will get more details about the occupation. If it is about thing, you get more details about thing, right? And though these are open data sources, which there might be a slight question of reliability, but because they are publicly moderated, they are reliable in the aggregate. So if you're dealing with big data, they are certainly going to show up certain trends which indicate a certain cultural truth. What I do, I take within this certain box of South Asia, primarily these coordinates, and I pick up certain basic data regarding the birth and death of persons, as well as optional data. Not everybody has all this data inscribed, but if they are there, the algorithm will pick it up. So there's education, occupation, and family. There's 3 data points that I'm going to use today. And let's go into the analysis. The first thing that I do is look at what is the influence of education on migration. So when I go to this and I find that there are about 11,000 people have their place of education mentioned, but we do not have any information on the location. That is either the residence for people who are alive or death for people who have died. we have no information. So that takes out of our data set a sizable number. But we still have a 3,500 people, about 3.5 and 1,000 people. So that's about 4,500 people whom we know about their locations. Now, out of this 3,500 who moved for education, they stayed on at the place of education. A large number actually stayed on at their place of education, and a smaller number, sort of 354, returned to their place of birth after the place of education, after their education was over. But there were some people who never left their birthplace for education, and out of that, actually, never about 210 odd never left their birthplace at all, both either for education or for work, right? So that gives us a sense now that almost for 70 to 80% of the population, uh, education becomes a very important source for migration, where they continue to work where they got educated. All right, let us return to the next slide. Now we take this 210 who were these figures, and we see what are the locations of people who were educated at their place of birth, at the same place. And we get that Kolkata as the most important city where people choose to get educated at the place of birth. Now you can say that Kolkata is a very good education system, which is why which many people in Bengal may not agree with. But the data at least shows this. But this is, mind you, across changed. But other important in South Asian cities, particularly capital cities and metropolitan cities, also managed to retain people with their education system. If you go on to the next bit of data, and we find, now we contest that, and we see that Calcutta continues to have a large number of people who return after education. That's by far everybody else. So that may be put together, and one would not say that Bengal or Calcutta really have a great degree of employment opportunities if you go by the literature. Then, so there is something happening there. So what we need to do is we need to put this on a timeline. And if we put it on a timeline, we find that the locations, primary locations of the people migrating, in the cultural domain, that is in theater and cinema personalities, change over time. We see initially a lot of people at around 1930s moving towards Calcutta, and then we see a lot of people moving towards Bombay ever since the partition. And Bombay really becomes, Bombay or Mumbai later becomes the hub of where the entertainment industry really takes off in post-colonial India. But what we see is interesting. There's a certain bit of movement towards the end of the century around the south. Now, what does that translate into? That translates into what in my next slide clearly shows that while the rest of India have a fair share, 71% of people who were born to the theatre and cinema industry, their share dwindled down to only 31%, with the top 10 cities taking in terms of base who died there, right? Now, cities which had persons who were born and died at the same place, within that, Mumbai and Kolkata, of course, top it up. So these are the cultural, this is how we identify the cultural centers of India. But we see that fewer and fewer people are dying off in Kolkata or being born in Kolkata, and Mumbai is really picking up. And my next slide sort of shows that newer cities like Pune and Bangalore and Chennai are really picking up, the blues representing the births and the reds representing the deaths. Now, if we go to Google Ngrams, we find this belies a certain kind of thing, where we see Delhi getting a peak, and that is because Delhi pulls people because of a large number of politicians who are actually born in Delhi. Right now, if we look at another aspect of this, dynasties among Indian politicians, we can within a network graph, we see certain dynasties. And most importantly, you can see that the Nehru Gandhi family is definitely there, but they are littered with other families. But the Scindia family is very, very important if you see in terms of the constellation. But really speaking, if we check out dynasties in other fields in Indian life, you find that business, of course, has bigger dynasty, more number of share of dynasties than in politics. But the real place where the dynasties are in the place of the entertainment industry. That is, producers, actors, and other people involved in the family really takes the cake, but you can see the very large constellation. So we sort of can contest the fact that Indian politics is dynastic, because I would say Indian politics is more democratic than Indian business, the world of Indian business, and the world of Indian entertainment. One final point, very interesting. If we take a close look at the Nehru Gandhi family, we find in here there's a figure called Antonio Mino. Many people may not recognize him, but this is who Antonio Mino is, better known as Sonia Gandhi. Now, on Wikidata, as of today, I don't know at the moment, she appears as Antonio Mino because somebody edited her name to her Italian name. And you know that this is a huge political issue in India for the last 2 decades. Her Italian origin has been an important challenge to the party she has led over the last decade and a half or more, 2 decades, and this is and therefore here is a contestation within the data source. There is in another place I have dealt with how we can look at that, but what I would like to contend is that in the digital world, data shapes perception, data shapes cultural meaning, and therefore there are data wars, and in those data wars, to preserve democracy, we need to resort to more linked open data, to make research available to linked open data, so that we can challenge the efforts to actually create a kind of a perception through doctoring of data. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was absolutely fascinating. And you can already see panelists clapping. And Dr. Menon, I see, is already clapping. And absolutely, it was fascinating. I have a couple of points before I move on to. I'll have a lot of questions for you, Dr. Ghosh, when we go into the question answer session. But I'm just going to use this last statement that you made about data shaping perceptions, because that allows us a wonderful transition into our next presentation from Dr. Maya Dodd. Dr. Maya Dodd is an associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Flame University, and her project today, or her presentation today, is creating digital archives in India, the public's record. And I think what Arjun's presentation has told us is data shapes perception. I think we'd be very keen to know from Maya what kind of data speaks. Is all data allowed entry into the public sphere, or do archives only preserve certain forms of data? So, Dr. Maya Dodd, the screen is yours. Maya, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Dibya, can you not do that? The host, unmute her.
I'm not the host right now.
I have done it.
Yeah, I think Maya is unmuted.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay.
Perfect, Maya. Thank you. Thanks. And I had a wonderful introduction to you, and I also sort of asked for the transition about what kind of data, if data shapes perceptions, what kind of data speaks. So if you take it away, please.
You can see my screen?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for that, Arjun. It is such a perfect segue for my part. Really, I mean, there is no question that we have been dealing with, opaque data, and this is the story of our time, right? How does data talk, and how do we narrate it? Now, clearly, there is a historical and a literary perspective on this also. Many of us actually have come from that space, and so in some senses, those are the two traditions I'm going to be drawing from as I go forward in this year. So in India, the digital humanities are as much a function of open access to information, right, by the state, as they are about citizen-led efforts to liberate data. The archives of the state opening up since going digital, right, has democratized access to state-controlled information, and this invites reflection. It's often assumed that the government has its secrets, right, and hence data sets are deliberately left incomplete. However, a crisis like the COVID pandemic now puts this hypothesis to test. The issue of archiving is related to evidence, and this is where the dataset's veracity is critical. In keeping with DH scholarship on data as narrative, I present this case comparing two types of archival opportunities. I want to present a dilemma in how the question of access, and specifically the creation of archives, offers a story of narrating data and eventually creating public accountability in India. Since the arrival of crowdsourced digital archives, the question of quality of data and access to it sees new possibilities. That is to say, the way we assess the accuracy of an archive and how we access that archive has fundamentally changed since the arrival of digital platforms. Just as we've seen with crowdsourced efforts across digital archives that aim at preservation, in times of COVID, all data gathering ventures, right, public and state, are required for a critical task. Hence, to narrate the effort at tracking data and building archives, especially during such times of emergency, underscores the need for improved digital access to improve public accountability. Okay. To explain this, how I would like to do this is to point to the creation of archives during two times of emergency. One is the political event of the 1975 Indian emergency, which we could say was a democratic emergency, and the second is the archiving of COVID data, which is also in a sense an emergency archive, right? It details an evolving pandemic that we are all currently living. In the case of the emergency, it would seem to be a vanished event with discrete historical markers, right? 75 to 77. And in the case of tracking COVID, it would appear as a living archive, hence underscoring the difference between what is supposedly past and what is present. My talk will challenge this distinction and unite both these archival, digital archive efforts through the question of what is made visible in the long run by the users of these archives. So, to begin with the emergency, one could make the case that it constitutes a static archive, right? So, meaning all that's to be done is collect materials around this event and catalog them in a space, right? That's what the National Archives of India purports to do. It's the official site for declassified files, and it admits events of the past along with official documents of the past, while also including official documents that were once denied public viewing, right? Even by official channels. Now, even today, files are being declassified and new accounts of the emergency are abundant with these new materials. While this is in play, the official story is also countered by other versions, an alternate forum of visibility by counter representation, if you know. There's a 600-page anthology called The People versus Emergency, where the anthologists ask if it's even possible to write a true and complete history, right, of this event, given that the traumas of individual experiences were so numerous. Citing the imprisonment of 150,000 people, the vasectomies on 7 million men, they ask which historian can name every one of these innumerable people. Right? The authors are pointed in naming their work on the emergency as a saga, not a history. Right? Now, there are two main narratives of the emergency. One relates to personal reflection, and the other to party or citizen group publications. Right? All in all, they span state and party publications, socio-legal commentary, fictional rendering as witness, and testimonials and prison diaries and journalistic accounts. These materials exceed the National Archives, and this is given way now to a crowdsourced to other repositories, such as this one, which is hosted at the University of Göttingen, and is an archive of oral history testimonies, which are around the time of the Indian emergency. So many of those sort of survivors are currently alive, and so this attempts to document that time. So we see this sort of multiplication of archival spaces through that. Now, the materials that exceed the National Archive, right, have given way, as I said, to this. And so let's complicate the idea of how data is admitted to an archive. And from that, we can understand how these narratives are sort of coming out of these different repositories, different narratives in different spaces. So this allows us also to compare two types of data, right? Which is one is the old archive and one is the new archive. In the old analog model, the archive admitted official and certified information that I'll call licensed data, right? And in the new model, we have more what we can call unlicensed data, right? Of course, and this is the point, that the sort of history of information tells us that licensed and unlicensed data always existed, right? Yes, you had the official newspaper and such, but you also had the pamphlet. You also had the prison diary during the emergency. We've had official, the Press Trust of India or other official news channels, but we've also had cable television. We've had now citizen journalism. And today, and this is where the COVID story sort of begins, right? We basically are viewing the sort of multiplicity of both registers in terms of the need for reconciling what the real narrative is, right? And I say real narrative because in the COVID story, we're really looking at numbers and that kind of data. So this quick timeline was just to track the evolution of what I'm calling unlicensed messaging that collapses the idea that micro-blogging today is a new form of parallel messaging, right? We've always had fora for unlicensed data, and this is where the digital archive, and especially the crowdsourced digital archive, acquires a new power. Now, to compare this, as I said, with the story of the COVID, digital archives that are being produced, just as we are seeing the need for accurate data, right, in India as in every other part of the world, we see an effort to multiply, efforts at producing accuracy. So the veracity of the numbers the state is working with is critical, right? And this is what I'm sort of calling the narration of data, because this is the way it seems to play out, right, in a sort of almost, parodic fashion. But yeah. So there is a scramble to reconcile numbers at the local and national level. And the acquisition and analysis of this knowledge is a far more collaborative activity now due to real-time need. The issue is further complicated because health is a state issue, and the burden of addressing the pandemic has largely been left to individual states for implementation purposes, even though states still have to technically adhere to central government guidelines. The creation of competing competent authorities at the state level are further challenged by the fact that the story is evolving at a local level. So here we see the states, like in Maharashtra, where I live, as in other states, aggregating data is happening at a district level, municipal level, ward level, prabhag level, and so on. Now, there's an issue about variance in accessibility of this data, especially at granular levels, which is important in keeping track of this pandemic. So the sources of data may be emanating from multiple layers of governance. However, the information is being disseminated from several sources, official and unofficial, right? So you can say licensed and unlicensed. Whether it's the daily updates from the press conferences, right, which is fully official, Ministry of Health and Welfare, or from the tweets of the municipal corporations for citywide data, right, or indeed by local MLAs for their constituencies, right, releasing sort of these numbers through WhatsApp messages and Twitter, their Twitter accounts. All of this is being actually made accessible for further analysis. So what this experiment is really making clear now is not only that digital archives for COVID are multiple, but the users of this information are also necessarily multiple. While to the best of my knowledge, there is no single official source that collates daily updates across the country at a granular level, the crowdsourced database COVID-19.org has become the digital platform of choice for several scientists and analysts. It's not just the public archive is often incomplete and in a big picture sense often inaccessible, but that the act of tracking the numbers of COVID cases ultimately relates to a political question of quality of governance. If the public's view of the open record is now the tool to gauge governance, not least for public health concerns, the need for a public audit, right, follows on. Already in India, and this is a lightning talk, so it's very truncated, there is a great deal of citizen-led aggregation of data from different sources. And this has been evident in civic tech efforts across different cities. Often open data meets, etc., have contributed great value, right, in the arrangement of information for public use and contemporary study. So from the examples of both the static and dynamic archives, the static being the supposedly official, the emergency being a vanished event, and the ongoing dynamic COVID pandemic, both of these archives require licensed and unlicensed sourcing, and public access to both, right, in digital platforms can coexist, as has been happening for a while. In the case of the emergency, digital archives are capturing what was untold by the official narrative. And in the case of COVID, the public audit continues. In India, especially, where the state and its reasons were often inscrutable, the right to information changed in a fundamental sense the optics of visualizing democracy. to now view this right as also the right of the public to record for themselves will be to unleash new accounts. The right to record assumes that the data used to create the record is accurate and credible, and narratives are built around this. Finally, though, who decides the veracity of these sources will be a function of public audit, as the narratives often outlast their records, real or imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dodd. That was, I hope I'm audible to everyone. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Dodd. That was fascinating. I have multiple questions, but I'm going
Yeah.
to pause them for now. Excuse me.
So
So I think
Dibya, I was not sure whether, well, I was not sure whether we were allowed to clap in this mode.
please do.
Because I
Please
think
do.
every presenter deserves it, I just
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Now, I think one of the very interesting things that comes from Dr. Dodd's Maya's presentation is when she talks of digital archives as a public audit of governance. What I am personally interested in knowing is that, in this kind of information age, one of the things that I teach my students is that it's not only important to understand and look at archives, but understand the politics of curation behind those archives, right? The specific politics of curation that shapes those archives. And I was just wondering how you look at the model of curation as, and I'm happy to come back to that, but maybe we can put a pin on that, right? On the politics of curation, which kind of mediates the idea of publicness as well as the archive itself, right? So that's something that I would love to come back to when we come for the question and answer session, right? So which takes us into, again, excellent and very interesting territory. I'm so happy that we are getting to share this panel with such diverse and wonderful work, which is introducing us to various facets and the groundedness of it. And I know it's a bad pun, but as Maya points out, right, it's dirty is grounded DH, right? So I'm going to plug that right now here. And on that basis, right, we'll just quickly transition into what is often not understood as grounded, but hopefully Dr. Deshbandhu today will help us understand how the idea of gaming, which is considered usually leisure, right, for privileged people, and not necessarily something as a democratic activity, because you apparently need a lot of technological paraphernalia. There's a lot of techno positivism about gaming. So this is Dr. Deshbandhu, and his paper today is called Charting the Indian Gamescape. Welcome, Dr. Deshbandhu, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for having me on the panel today. So I'll quickly set up the share screen. Is it visible? The slides have come up?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, so how do I put it? So I kind of try and understand video games from two kinds of levels. First and foremost, as what they mean to players who play them. And secondly, what players do to those video games. So a lot of what I kind of work with, especially, tries and looks at not the standard general procedure of what games do to players, but rather what players do to games. And I kind of build this on Nick Coldry's understanding of something called media as practice. And so kind of to give you a general overview of things. So most importantly, why study video games? A lot of times I'm asked this particular question across wherever I tend to present. I mean, why exactly are you studying it? Is it serious enough? I mean, is it serious academic research? What exactly are you trying to do? So I try and think about it as much as I can. But the more I think about it, the more when I look at it, at least for the supposed millennial, that's the big thing that people are trying to understand, especially if I look at it from Payal Arora's recent work on the next billion users in India, and also other research emanating from the world. It's interesting to kind of understand that video games are increasingly becoming part of families, becoming part of people's everyday lives. And the standard transition where they start off as a leisure practice or a hobby of sorts, and then they become a little more than that. They become part of the everyday rubric, and the transfer or the transmute from being an activity to a practice to a habit to a ritual kind of thing. So I kind of try and situate my work in that context. And also I try and look at video games in the frame of the everyday. So when I say everyday, I'm looking at DH2020, I'm looking at Featherstone. So I'm trying to understand how video games become an intricate part of the players' everyday lives, and how the rest of the day or the rest of their lives are built around it. So to kind of understand, I look at video games as cultural artifacts. The study understands gaming as a practice in an everyday context. So, yep, moving on. So, yeah, so one of the most interesting things, at least that comes from the subfield of video game studies, or ludology as it is called, there is no one concrete definition to what it means to be game. I mean, what is a game? It's almost impossible to define. So one of the most difficult things is if you are trying to understand games as activities that lead to fun, how could you tell someone who spends time with Microsoft Paint and has fun painting on it that, hey, that's not a game? Correct? So that's one of the most difficult things to do. And I kind of like the fact that we can't define what is a game, because it allows us to go into as many intersections, as many boundaries, and blur those boundaries and go into different ways of understanding what can a game be. So I like that open-endedness of it. So moving on, if you look at game studies literature in general, or the way researchers trying to understand video games, the three broad ways are games as activities. Classical game studies scholars, Huizinga, Maigard, Kailua, try and understand them as that. The second one is games as systems, comes predominantly to us from the Scandinavian countries, where they try and understand video games as computational systems with specific rules in them, where people negotiate and find out ways to get beneficial outcomes, or negotiable outcomes anyway. The third, the more interesting angle, I guess, where I kind of work as well, games as social acts, as how they become parts of the society, how they become parts of people's everyday lives. So I guess the people who have done phenomenal work here, Malaby, when he talks about games as processual, and Tom Bolstock from University of California, Riverside, Irvine, who also tries and understands games as what they mean in society. He tries and understands them in culture in three separate things. But the most important question is what is called the Wittgensteinian conundrum, asked to us by the scholar Wittgenstein, when he says it's almost impossible to understand what a game is. And if it's almost impossible to understand what a game is, it's also very, very difficult to define play. And I kind of build on that a little bit. So yeah, while other scholars in the field consider it to be a major determinant, I on the fact celebrate the fact that there is no concrete definition for it. So which also allows me to then say that there are no concrete ways of defining who a gamer is, and no concrete way of defining what the actor plays, which allows us to do a lot of very interesting work in that regard. Okay, so this particular attempt at what I'm trying to present today is part of a larger study, where though I'm focused today only on trying to understand how to chart the Indian gamescape, or how the various acts and facets of play in India can kind of be charted. So yeah, one second. So the objectives of this larger study were to identify and understand gaming practices, behavior, and attitudes that contribute to the creation of a core gaming experience for players, to explore the various boundaries and intersections between the gaming and non-gaming worlds of players, both in an everyday context and also in the offline-online divide of sorts, which is increasingly becoming blurred. If you look at the kind of work that's happening from somebody like Dana Boyd when she says the always-on lifestyle. The third factor to kind of consider, to map the gamer's experiences, I was trying to arrive at a sort of an emic understanding and identify the key points and crucial signposts and landmarks along the path. And most importantly, how does it become a part of their everyday, as I already mentioned. Yeah. So moving on, and this is, I think, the part where I would like to stress on a little more. There are a lot of challenges when you try to understand the act of playing games in India. It's a very, very diverse and dispersed practice. If you look at the kind of work that comes to us from Nimi Rangaswamy and Payal Arora, they try and explain to us how various players from different sections of the society try and understand games. India is also one of those countries where we also see various dimensions of play, like shared play. So when I say shared play, two or three people sharing a particular device to play a game on, while two are watching, the third is playing, and the various complex mechanics that emerge there. Apart from shared play, you also have other concepts like sharing patterns of gaming content among players, The third thing, the various dimensions of these play. So forced play, for instance. The various ways in which Indian gamers try and access games and gaming artifacts, which are normally not available to them in terms of economics. Things that they cannot afford, or on the other side, things that just do not come to India, for example. So the various ways in which they try and bend things, in which they open up various passages to try and get access to those things. So very, very diverse and very, very dispersed. And this also happens because class, gender, context, access and affordability, all of them play a significant element of it. So to chart the Indian gamescape is not as easy as, say, charting the gamescape of another nation, of, say, a nation in the global north. Because things like access to the internet, access to the latest digital platforms or technology or consoles or devices is almost considered to be a given. Okay. So, however, in the Indian game space, things don't work like that. A lot of different practices emerge in the Indian game space because as players try and overcome the barriers posed to them by these things. So, for example, if you look at the very act of hacking and cracking of games, how players of specific classes try and understand how to overcome those things and gain access to content they want, but they are not able to. Similarly, games, how they are limiting in terms of, say, gender, for example, in terms of context. Also, the huge element of access, right? So while we are all trying to celebrate on one side the umbrella that is, the success story that is Digital India, the stark reality is that for a lot of people who access internet, the numbers are not the way they are kind of presented, right? So most of the people who access internet are still on their mobile devices, and players of mobile games are not considered to be hardcore gamers by the gaming community. So there are a lot of problems there. So the challenge of a study like this was to not trivialize any kind of play or engagement, or not to be celebratory of any kind. So to try and treat all ludic pursuits as evenly as possible. And I felt, or rather, the more and more I worked with something like this, I realized the right capturing of such diverse data can help break several traditional binaries and stereotypes in the global gaming space. So especially the way the gaming industry views players, right? One such binary, which I found in my data, in the analysis that broke significantly, was the hardcore gamer and the casual player divide. So a lot of such binaries kind of break if the data is captured holistically. So this particular paper, or this presentation, focuses specifically on trying to understand how to holistically probably capture that data and chart that gaming space. So I'm showing one possible trajectory. There could be several possible trajectories as long as you try and identify what is it that you're specifically trying to understand. So I was trying to study gaming experience and how players engage with those games and how those interactions shaped both their lives and the experiences that they were having. So video games are postmodern media, or probably, if you look at it, one of the most fluid media we have when it comes to access. So if you take Espen Arset's traditional understanding of ergodic, so on that spectrum of interactivity, video games are at the far end, where interactivity is significantly high. Okay, so the fluid nature of the gaming experience makes it almost impossible to get what is called a fixed text for analysis. I don't want to delve into this too much, but in traditional game studies, some of the biggest debates have been about this. Should we focus on the fun and the play elements of a game, or should we focus on games as storytelling platforms and the narratives that they kind of provide players? So I'm not trying to belabor that debate further, but the challenge is, how do we try and capture experiences in order to try and understand what a game means to those players? So if you look at it, scholars like Belstoff, Flynn, Keogh, all of them have come up with various ways. One such way that I kind of work with is something called co-playing. So in order to try and understand how co-playing works, there were 4 specific concepts that I took and tried and integrated. One of them was called the magic circle, comes to us from Salon and Zimmerman. They talk about how spaces and geographies, space and time both acquire specifically new meanings when an act of game play starts. So the moment play begins, the whole rules of the particular place in which the play is happening kind of change. The second is something called puzzle piece, comes to us from somebody called Deshbandhu, who talks about how the magic circle should not be understood as a homogeneous, impervious space, but a kind of a space that when you enter, everything begins to make meaning. So it's like that missing piece of the puzzle that you're putting in to fix things all over. The third is comes to us from somebody called Arsenal, from two scholars called Arsenal and Perron, who talk of something called the magic cycle, where they try and understand each game as an endless series of cycles. So every time somebody plays a particular game, correct? So they enter in and they go out. So each act of gameplay has several windows. And lastly, recursive space. So every time anybody plays a game, one makes a move and everybody else is in response to that particular move. So what I'm trying to say is all these four concepts I tried to crystallize and bring together to try and get a concrete, sort of a concrete method of sorts. So yeah, so I was borrowing the key strengths from all of those four platforms to arrive at a holistic understanding. So then the biggest challenge was how do we define gamers for this? Correct. So I thought one of the best ways to kind of do it was to understand, to view players of games who understood gaming as their predominant leisure time activity. And when I worked with something like that, it opened up a lot of avenues for me because I did not want to go into that classical divide of, do you think you're a gamer? Because most of the players who I was encountering, whose experiences I was trying to chart, would not want to call themselves gamers. So one of the outcomes of the study was, what exactly it means to be gamer worthy, for example. Similarly, gaming, it kind of came across as a multifarious activity, which was digital in nature, but spread across platforms. And all of those platforms were equally important to try and understand. So just as important to understand Snake on a Nokia feature phone, as important as to understand something as cutting edge as, The Last of Us 2 or Ghost of Tsukushima on the PlayStation 4. Moving on from that, I thought a snowball technique could something kind of work because of the fact that, the gaming community is so closely knit. So it kind of worked. And then research tools, and this is where the most interesting element kind of happens, I guess. I used in-depth interviews, but in line with something called co-playing. Now, co-playing was a derivation of what is called ethnographic understanding. So kind of a variation or improvement on the standard participant observation, where I sat with people and kind of played games with them, tried to understand what the act of play meant to them, looked at them actually engaging with those games, and was playing with them. So very interesting because I was trying to establish my credibility as a player of the game, but at the same time I was trying to collect data. So very, very interesting in that. And the third thing was, try and understand journals and diaries. So, this is the method I kind of developed. So trying to focus on not trivializing one thing over the other, trying not to celebrate one style of gameplay over the other, and most importantly, trying and stitching together as many kinds of play in that diverse Indian game space and bringing them together. Because we're trying to arrive at a broader understanding of gaming culture and as inclusive as one could be, right? So that's kind of same thing. So that's it, I guess. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you, Dr. Deshbandhu, for a wonderful presentation. And I think a couple of questions I just want to flag and sort of signpost right now so that we can come back to this later. One thing is that, one aspect of gaming that you talked about was games as computational devices. And that's something that I would like to interrogate and ask your view on, because from a very, very sort of delusion, Guattarian point of view, considering that every gaming activity is an immersive activity right now, wouldn't you think of games as socio-technical systems rather than computational systems? That's my question for you. Yeah, so you can take that later on. I just want to signpost it so that I don't forget it later. And second thing is, this idea of ergodic, right? The idea of ergodic, which is basically non-trivial pursuits, which our set talks about. And I'm only an occasional game scholar, so I might not be as, in depth with that terminology. But I would like you to sort of break that down, right? How is gaming a non-trivial pursuit, and how does that allow us to think of it in terms of the digital humanities paradigm? Because kind of the spaces that we live in, we also have to think about what games do for us, right? What can they do for us, right? So I'm going to now take off my hat of a moderator for the next 15 minutes, and try to follow up the wonderful and possibly acts that can't be really followed up, but we'll try. So Nirmala and I, Dr. Nirmala Menon and I, Dr. Dibyadyuti Roy, will present on our paper, which is called No Making Not Now, a distant reading of Indian DH. And Dr. Nirmala Menon is associate professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Indore, and she's also the leader of the Digital Humanities Research Initiative there. And I am Dr. Dibyadyuti Roy. I am an assistant professor at the Department of Communication at the Indian Institute of Management in Indore. And Nirmala and I, as I mentioned, had the privilege of co-organizing the first DH conference in June 2018. So today, many of our insights are taken from there. And I'm going to start sharing screen right now. And hopefully it should work. Okay, so is that visible to everyone? Is my PowerPoint visible to everyone? If someone could just say yes.
You're visible. Your PowerPoint is visible.
Thank you so much. So what we're going to do is basically, for the first few slides, I'm going to talk, and then Nirmala is going to take over. So our topic, as I mentioned to you, is No Making Not Now, a distant reading of DH in India. And I'm going to start off with a story, because all narratives or all presentations are essentially stories that we talk about data. Someone mentioned during the last 30 Twitter conference that stories are data with soul. So we'll talk about how we can make those stories of data with soul. Okay, so I'm going to begin with something which most of you, if you're invested in the world of digital humanities, you might be aware of. Last year, the Chronicle of Higher Education published a series of articles, point counterpoint articles, which were tagged as the digital humanities wars. And they had people on both sides of the spectrum, people who believe that digital humanities is the next step in taking humanities work forward. And there are also people who believe that digital humanities will be a debacle. Right? And obviously, many of you think of the Timothy Brennan essay, The Digital Humanities Bust, which we actually operationalized during our 2018 conference. So this one, the two essays that I picked up were written expressly against each other. And by against, I mean, obviously in a very scholarly, academic way, to counter each other. And one of the essays was called The Digital Humanities Debacle, which was by Professor Da from University of Notre Dame, who's, I believe, a literary historian of Chinese and American literature. And the counterpoint was given by Ted Underwood, who talked about Dear Humanists, Fear Not the Digital Revolution. Now, as a foot soldier of digital humanities in post-colonial space, I read both these essays with great enthusiasm. But somehow I felt there was something that was, bothering me. As Sherlock Holmes would say, or Benedict Cumberbatch in the Sherlock Holmes avatar would say, that often your intuition is when your brain can't process data at the same speed that it's taking place. So I did what every digital humanist would do. I went and voyanted it, right? So I went and uploaded both the articles on Voyant, and I wanted to see what they were exhibiting. And interestingly, and I think on your screen you can see the first article, the summary analysis of digital humanities debacle. It showed that the most frequent words in the corpus were literary. The second was CLS, which is computational literary studies, data, computational, and humanities, which is the last in the number of most frequent words in the corpus. It was the last word. And when you looked at Dear Humanists, Fear Not the Digital Revolution, similarly, you can see that new humanists, literary, history, and quantitative, literary and history occupy the most number of mentions, right? One of the most frequent words. This made me think, right? Now I got why I was bothered. I was bothered because again and again, the signified of digital humanities is becoming canonical literary studies. And by that, please understand, I don't mean to sort of disrespect traditional literary studies or any kind of canonical scholarship in literary studies. But digital humanities cannot be a signified for literary and canonical literary studies, especially in post-colonial and South Asian spaces. And this is basically one of the things we are going to operationalize throughout our presentation today. And Nirmala is going to come back and talk later about it. So some of the key provocations that came from this question for us, all of us remember that famous essay by Melissa Terras in 2011, when she takes in Ramsey's big tent metaphor, when she says that, Stephen Ramsey talks about the big tent metaphor where digital humanity should be a big umbrella where everyone should be given space. And Melissa Terrace comes and says that there'll be a lot of folk left peering into the big tent without ever gaining full access, right? That's a great question to ask. But we ask not what people are peering, not about the people who are peering into the big tent. We ask what happens if our spatio-temporal location does not grant us the privilege of knowing that such a big tent exists. So obviously there's one paradigm where there's a big tent, funny, good things are happening, fun things are happening inside the big tent, you try to peer in. But what if you don't even know that there is a big tent? What happens then? So we use this metaphor to understand that how important is it for Indian humanities researchers, pedagogues, practitioners to identify as digital humanists, to participate and contribute in the global project of digital humanities. And here I'm taking in both the hegemonic understanding of the global project of digital humanities, which is possibly the ADHO conference and peer review conferences like this, as well as what is understood as the resistive model, like the DAT camps or the unconferences. Personally, and
I think there is some issue at Dibyadyuti's end. I mean, Nirmala, you can.
The audio is gone. Yeah.
Nirmala, would you like to continue?
Can. I just wanted to give him a minute to come back if he can,
Yes.
because it would.
I think he's having connectivity issues. You see that little yellow triangle, no?
Yeah.
Shows a low bandwidth on his computer.
answer is yes. Right? And for that,
Oh,
We
okay,
lost
Dibya, we
him.
lost you for a minute there.
okay, how far was I audible?
So that's fine. You can just finish off with this slide.
Yeah, so were you able to hear this part of the slide or the first part of the slide?
Yes. It was in the second part that, we kind of lost you.
Okay, so in the second part, what I was talking about, that we are talking about specifically about Indian digital humanities with its specificities and limitations, such as the technological divide, lack of a linguistic unifier, and unequal educational structures. Can it develop a new theory and a decolonized praxis for global DH? And I specifically want to focus on Indian digital humanities here and not on South Asian digital humanities, which have a different kind of signifier. And I'm happy to talk about that more. And I believe yes, because in India, and I'm going to use this as an example or a metaphor for what technology can and what digital humanities can do. So this is Dr. Sugato Mitro, who in 1999 became famous for the hole in the wall experiment. And many of you must be aware of this, that what Dr. Mitro did was in a slum in the Kalkaji area of Delhi, Dr. Mitro went and installed a computer and with several programs and sort of computational tools inbuilt into that system. And when slum children went and asked him what was it for, Dr. Sugato Mitro said nothing and he walked away. So what happened after 3 weeks? Their assumption was that the computer would get taken away and something would happen to that system. But instead, when he came back after 3 weeks, he realized that the children were playing there and they were creating interfaces and doing new things with it. So interestingly, what he understood was that not only were people subverting the usual understanding of technology by using the computer for things differently, but even that terminology through which they were understanding different computational objects or computational software objects like the hourglass, as you can see on screen. Interestingly, they described the computer in their own terms, often coining words to indicate what they saw on screen. For instance, the children's word for the hourglass symbol that appears when a small wooden drum shape was called Damru, the symbol for the Hindu god Shiva. The mouse cursor was called Sui, a Hindi word for needle, or Tir, which means arrow. Now, why do I give you this example? I give you this example because it takes back to one of the fundamental debates in digital humanities, the hack versus yak debate, right? So there's this huge fight. Are you a hacker or are you a yacker, right? If you're a hacker, you do computational stuff. If you're a yacker, you talk a lot and you create those cultures of conversation. Now, this is what I want to ensure that we understand, that these vocabularies of yakking or the affordances of hacking are decided by the center. And by center, I mean the Anglo-American episteme, which creates the epistemes for DH for us. What I want to claim in, and together with Nirmala, I think, as a paper we want to talk about, is that stop giving us your affordances of hacking or your vocabularies of yakking from the center. Instead, let us move from the periphery with our own versions of what hacking or yakking are. And these can be a dialogue, right? And over the next few slides, Nirmala is going to give you more examples. You've got many already where those kind of dialogue takes place as an always already kind of conversation. But in the next few slides, Nirmala will also tell you more about it. But the next slide, for example, I want to quickly tell you why we make these assertions, right? We make these assertions not in vacuum, but from our example of organizing the first Thai conference, where we had participation from 15 Indian states and 5 countries. And since then, we were called Thai then, Digital Humanities Alliance of India. Since then, we have now had a name change. We are now called the Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations, which we believe allows us a wider ambit. And we also saw some of these conversations come across during our 30 Twitter conference, where the sheer gamut and the sheer diversity of projects, which moved far beyond the limited signifieds of digital humanities in Anglo-American spaces, really made us very happy. So for the next few slides, I'm going to request my colleague Nirmala to take up, and I'm going to stop share. I'm going to ask her. I'm going to still share screen, but ask her to pick up the baton.
Yeah, thank you, Dibya. That's that was wonderful. And I think what we are trying to do, and in this paper that's going to be published soon, is now in the next few slides, since we don't have a lot of time, I'm just going to show you how to operationalize what Dibya is talking about here. And the way I look at it is to talk about the regional. So what do I mean by the regional term? What I mean is that if we were to do a mapping of digital humanities work across the country, right? And if we were to look at projects that don't self-declare as digital humanities projects, but we think are at the intersection of the human and the digital, what would it look like? And it most likely looks like my electrical poles in old Delhi, rather than very neat linear graphs that we would we would be able to generate on a computer, right? So what that also means that it is going to be multilingual, it's going to be chaotic, and it's going to be cacophonic, right? What I want us to do, and what we both want us to do, is to pause and say that the theory of digital humanities, the vocabulary of that theory, is in the making. We do not want to kind of want to kind of constrain it as it is making itself, because there are a lot of things that we still don't know about digital humanities work in India. I just want to show you like a few examples. One is like about pedagogy, and the other is about some projects, research projects. So in this next slide that you see, this is a visualization I had done for the wonderful book that our colleague Dr. Maya has edited about pedagogy, digital pedagogy across Indian universities. So that figure that you see is about a lot of public universities who do not have formal digital humanities programs. What they do, however, have courses that take in digital literacy in some form or the other, right? Some of it is across, say, economics, across political science, across computer science and history, about computer application. And all of this also kind of intersects with government, self-government, the kind of data that comes in through those, and to study those data, right? On the other hand, like you have research centers, like you see we are 3 of us here from IITs Indore, Jodhpur, and Delhi, but in many other IITs and IIMs in Presidency, in Jadavpur, you see research groups that are looking at very localized kind of digital projects, right? And when you have a kind of a macro look at those projects, what you see, Dibya, can we go to the next slide?
Sure.
What we see is, yes, is that this is a very multilingual group of projects. And this is just an example of some of the projects that I was able to put on one slide. Right? And if we have to use these projects as a reservoir or as a repository, then you realize that you need digital humanities work that don't look at only the the Roman and Anglo scripts, right? You need, you have Devanagari, you have Dravidian, you have, Gurmukhi. There is all kinds of different language scripts that are at work in all these digital humanities projects across the country. And the two big ones here, when you look at the Shodh Ganga, the repository of Indian thesis, as well as the National Digital Library of India, at least the 16 languages of the 6th schedule are represented in these two repositories, right? So when we are going to look at projects, or we are going to look at, DH projects across the country, you have to factor in, what a project Madurai is looking at, in Tamil literatures or in Tamil scripts, and what are kind of the outcomes of that work, right? So if we have to have, and I think we may almost never have what might be called a digital humanities theoretical vocabulary from India. What we will have are multiplicities of theoretical frameworks. And I think that multiplicity of theoretical frameworks is not just important, it is essential, and it is actually a strength of Indian digital humanities. We can go to the next slide. So I want to, since we don't have the time to go through all of those projects, I just wanted to, click on one project that we were trying to do, and we are trying to do at IIT Indore, which is mapping Indian languages and literature scholarship. Now, this is simply a very small, this is being done in collaboration with my students. All of my students have been involved in this, collecting data, making linked data, as Arjun was pointing out earlier, of scholarship in Indian language literatures in those languages, and simply index and cite them and make them discoverable and in a way that can be discovered and disseminated, right? So that, the idea is to understand that unless we have these databases, then you cannot have them discoverable. And if you have them there and they are discoverable, there is no excuse for someone to look at Indian digital humanities or Indian literatures and make theoretical assumptions without taking into account all of this different textual data that is available. So the attempt is to make that in some ways available. There's one more slide before we go to the next one. Dibya?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
this is the challenge.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So we Maya talked about archives. So if archives are repositories of power, databases are the pathways to that power. And in the case of literatures, it's the road to canonicity. The awareness about databases as a digital site for research and knowledge production is reflected in these transitions, and we need to make sure that those repositories are reflected in the multiplicity of languages that they are performed within in the Indian context, right? So building these databases that are inclusive and diverse, paying attention to digital infrastructures to confront questions of structural inequities that appear to us to be the core of Indian digital humanities. That many of the challenges that we need to address is now manifested in a digital ecosystem. So in other words, the questions that we're asking are not very different from what we have always done as humanists. But because, it's a digital ecosystem that encompasses algorithms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and language processing, it makes it imperative that we train our students in the complexities of this new order so they can question, critique, and challenge its underlying assumptions. Acceptable tools, open access tools can work for everyone without perpetuating a definitive techno-determinism. And demystifying some of the process of technology development will equip them to investigate the changing modes of ethics, diversity, and inclusiveness to ensure that the digital frontiers incorporate these factors at the developmental stage. So one of the slides that I could not show was an open access publishing platform that we have launched from IIT Indore, which is called Knowledge Sharing in Publishing. And to make that platform multilingual and having conversations across these different languages, right? And what the above examples, I think we're going above time, but what the above examples demonstrate is that the diversity of disciplines, projects, and motivations constituting what we argue is a digital humanities landscape in India makes it organically transdisciplinary and promises the methodological and social diversity that Alan Liu pointed out was wanting in Anglo-American DH. So if digital humanities is an umbrella term is to have a role in India, it must be one of documenting, harnessing, and facilitating these kinds of works and projects, as well as empowering their access to resources, both capital and academic, to ensure that engagement with the digital is rewarding and incentivized within academia at large. The labor and intellectual rigor involved in developing digital archives and repositories should be recognized as legitimate research output and not merely as appendages or ancillaries to quote unquote real humanist thinking. So, in other words, I want to conclude by saying making involves theorizing and doing. These components are inseparable if we have to understand the complex networks of the digital, the analog, and the human. I will stop here, but I do want to just make one final point, which is that, all these three things to me are linked, because unless we have access to data, unless we have access to open access data, if our, when one of my students had to do some work on thugs in Madhya Pradesh, right? She had to get a scholarship to go to the British Council, and because so many of the documents from the colonial era were with the British Council, right? That is a legacy of our colonial. But in 2020 and 2021, we should not be outsourcing that data and keeping it behind paywalls, which make it very difficult, unless, except in the most privileged institutions, for our students and our public to access. So I'll answer more detailed questions later. Thank you. Yeah, I think Dibya needs to just, so what are the challenges in getting to that point is, I think, what Dibya will explain in the last slide.
Right. Thanks so much, Nirmala. I think this is beautiful because it does allow the transition, and what we talked about SHIP as a project. I think SHIP is doing wonderful work, and we need to talk about that more. So in fact, it directly links to the challenges that we have. So the challenges, some of them mentioned, are the fact that we don't have enough, because we do not have enough regional literature in corpuses that exist in digitized spaces. Therefore, we lack good OCR software. We have some, but we lack good OCR software that is capable of digitizing printed Indic text with high levels of accuracy. Secondly, the idea of born digital or electronic literature, which is also a very important part of digital humanities, is still pretty nascent in our country. Also, very importantly, and this is something I hold very close to my heart, is that the intersectional implications of technology, race, gender, sexuality, and the often masculinist ideologies of technopositivism have only recently been included in DH understanding and DH scholarship on a global scale. So those need to be even considered in a post-colonial or a decolonized space. And lastly, and this is very interesting as well, this is also going to go into the last slide, the fact that India has a do-it-for-me attitude. India is the only country where IKEA had to tie up with Pepper Fry, because people in India, or upper caste men in India, don't like to make furniture by their own hand. So we have a problem with using our own hands, or to use our own hands involves a sort of caste politics which must be included into any idea of building and making, and we must interrogate and examine these ideas before we talk of digital humanities as a making project, right? So I want to end by quickly at this sort of very, very, very basic sort of flow chart that I have created. So we look at, from what we've understood so far, the claim that Nirmala and I are making is that DH is rhizomatic in India. Rhizomatic because, in the very Deleuzian Guattarian term, rhizomatic in the sense there is no primary taproot, there is no secondary taproot. It begins at points, there are flows, there are intensities, and it begins at various places without a specific teleology to it. So DH is rhizomatic in India, and it exists within the social imaginary of humanities, which is based in the colonial legacy, where in the colonial legacy, humanities was basically created to create babus to serve our imperial overlords. But for the last 6 decades, humanities scholars in the 7 decades rather, humanities scholars in this country have worked hard to challenge this colonial legacy. And DH emerges from that fight, that challenge. And that is
Yes.
all based in the governmental institution funding, which is increasing, the intersectional privileges that we academics, and one question that can come up is many of us, all of us on this panel are academics, we have a lack of representation from the galleries, libraries, archives, museum space, although we have spoken about them. And it also could be because conferences are spaces for largely educational institutions, but for something like DH, we need to have a far more, we might need to be far more enthusiastic and far more out, do much more work to introduce people from the GLAM sector. And we hope that this kind of conversation about Indian digital humanities is a praxis for catalyzing the humanistic, anti-hierarchical, non-exclusionary and collaborative signifies for the public digital humanities. And DH2020 had as one of its major themes the idea of public digital humanities, and we want to place it very simply, very clearly on this platform, because a neoliberal world order often doesn't allow for collaborative signifiers. So we want to claim that Indian digital humanities is a collaborative signified, it's a rhizomatic signified, and it might be heterotopic, it might exist in different spaces, but we will try and connect them together. Right? So thank you. I'm going to end sharing screen now, and we are going into question and answers. I'll ask all panelists to switch on their microphones and videos if possible. And I am going to first, thank all of them profusely. This is we all of us are aware of the challenges that we faced in creating this structure. I'm glad that we were able to do it though, because in some sense of the term, it was also trying to get a point across in terms of what the visibility of Indian digital humanities must be. So I think that's an important point. If any of the panelists want to start off the discussion, they are welcome to. Otherwise, I have some questions. I can see Nirmala raising her hand. Yes, please, Nirmala.
Yeah, I know. Thank you all very much. That was such a wonderful conversation. And my question, I wanted to start off with a question to Mayurakshi. Mayurakshi, that was a amazing, presentation, looking at or mapping migration. I was thinking that, whether you have looked at the honeybee network of Australia, Trevor, where they have this linked data of every single person in Australia, right? And whenever I see that, that data set, it always occurs to me that that would be an exercise that would be so impossible in India, right? But however, I'm wondering if there is a way in which we can have categories of data sets, of cultural data sets, right? That, as Maya pointed out, there are not government data sets, but that are people records, right? And then that would become a really kind of an amazing resource, right? So anyway, it's more of a comment, but I would like to know what you think of that.
Sure. Thank you very much, Nirmala. And I must thank Dibyadyuti for chairing this panel. It was a great learning experience for all of us, I believe. And it has opened up, I believe, so many doors, not just for us panelists, but I guess our viewers and people who would be watching this in the future. To come back to Nirmala, your question, that's a great question. And no, I haven't really dug deep into that data set, the honeybee data set of Australia, but it is definitely a possibility, and we need to build up that categories of data for migrants, and then, use them as linked data, because, that's how we need to get towards a larger question of the migration and DH question, if I may say. And also, now that you mentioned honeybee, as I was earlier discussing with Chiranjoy, migration produces patterns. So, whether it's an open door migration or whether it's a unidirectional migration, and these shapes are also very interesting to study. You migrate from place A to place B. Do you come back to A or you go to C? All these produces various patterns, and it's very, very interesting to visualize them and understand why that pattern emerged. So, yes, if I have answered your question, that
yeah.
Right. So, if I might add, Professor Mayurakshi, there's a question for you as well, which I just want to place here, which is a question from Sam Sanjay on our YouTube live. He says, Ma'am, can we interrelate the mobility which is at the post-colonial to the ancient history, pastoral nomadic society?
Right, yeah, I did see that question on the live chat. See, migration or mobility, if I may come back to that term, has been a process that has been omnipresent in the human history. I mean, history doesn't give us a moment when we see that, mobility did not take place. Even during lockdown in current times, life stopped, but did life stop inside the home? Did the ideological mobility of people stop? So mobility as a process, does not stop. And migration, if I may say, so the post-colonial and the decolonial are just contexts that we are adding to the migrants' experience here. Every migrant has their own experience, and so this is just the context we are adding. So, I mean, if I may go back to the question, can we interrelate the mobility, which is at the post-colonial, to the ancient history, pastoral nomadic society? So we are still talking about the mobility, we're still talking about migration, but the context would be very different.
Right. No, I think that's a very fair answer, and I think this kind of links to my next question, which I want to throw to Professor Arjun, and I think it probably brings in Arjun, Chiranjoy, and Mayurakshi together. So as I listen to both your presentations, your fascinating takes on migration, I kept thinking that migration is becoming, or at least in your presentation, migration is a very important way or a heuristic to understand the decolonized as well as post-colonial spaces. So, any comments on that, and what can DH do to augment that? Because one of the reasons that partition studies has been such a large part of our cultural history is because partition history talks about migration, right? So, in a way, migration has always been the heuristic, but not specifically in the ways we understand, like with the introduction of cultural analytics that Chiranjoy and Arjun bring in. So, any comments from you on that?
Dibya, can I add one line to your question?
Please do.
Yeah, just adding on to what you asked, I also wanted to know from Arjun, like, what are the do you know, what are the demographics of people who return to these cities? Like, you said that there was a certain number who returned, and in some cities the return rate is higher. So is there any specific about the demographics? That's it.
Nirmala, no, I haven't looked at the specific demographics. It would be good to look at the gender demographics more importantly,
Exactly.
probably
Yeah.
in that way. That's a good point, and one can and that's the fun about working with this kind of data, which is granular. It allows you to go back to the data and ask more and more questions. And so, typically in this kind of research, what one does is one cannot begin with a clear hypothesis. Some of the results actually belie our common opinion so that's what the data does. It helps us put to test some of the largely held beliefs or ideas which you cannot through any close analysis get through to. On the question of migration, really, I really think that we really haven't, in the post-colonial context, at least in the subcontinent, we really haven't paid too much attention to this question of the makers, because that is what leads to, in my own belief, to creation of these sites which lead to greater migration. I would imagine, let us say, since we see Mumbai to be such an important center for
Right, Professor Arjun, Professor Arjun, I think we lost the last part of your response. If you could just repeat that.
so I will just quickly repeat. So it is a major industry, and that sort of gives a certain picture to. Sorry, I'm going to come back to you because my daughter wants me to
Sure.
do something. I'm just
Sure,
not able to tell her to do.
Absolutely no issue. Absolutely no issue. Right.
Yeah.
I think we've got. Yes, Chiranjoy, please go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, that brings me into this, giving a kind of a hint regarding applying algorithms or designing new algorithms based on analyzing this data. See, usually, a very kind of a obvious way of representing it is using a graph. Okay, the nodes being the location and the edges between them can represent the migration, and it can be a directed or an indirected graph where the direction gives the flow. And we can come up with the various sort of algorithms to kind of analyze the reason behind such kind of a flow and represent those graphs in many ways, do some sort of a mathematical analysis of that graph, which has its own set of literature. People have looked into social networking, and there are many type of application being shown in analyzing the social network data, as well as interestingly there is a literature which is coming up which is known as the food computing. If people are interested, they can explore that, look into the cultural behavior and how it influences the food habits and various type of things people try to kind of various type of variables which influences this kind of data. So I think it also kind of set the stage for even for computer scientists also to look into the data. And as I think when towards the end of Nirmala's presentation, she actually hinted at that the questions are coming from humanities, but so far we could not answer them because the tools and the technology was not there. Now with this transdisciplinary approach, I think that we are in a position to ask those questions as well as very much near to answer those questions also. I think that's my opinion.
I think that's a very important point, and I think I'll use that as a segue to move into my.
Can I finish my answer? I didn't.
Yes,
Sorry,
please. Yes, please. I'm
I
sorry. Please
very
go ahead.
quickly. I think what films do is portray a certain culture, culture of opportunity. Let us say with important cities, and actually attract migration on unrelated fields, right? It's not merely let us say employment opportunities that would attract people for to a particular city, but the overall imagination of a certain kind, and this intersection that this kind of data related approach sort of leads to be able to show how we see the kind of dynastic politics, as I showed, is so ingrained within the entertainment industry in India, is allowing for that kind of portrayal of a certain cultural imagination, which is contrary to what's one belief. When we talk about dynastic politics or dynastic privilege, we primarily talk about the field of politics, but look at what the data shows up.
Right, perfect. Thank you so much. And I think those bring up very important questions. But in the interest of time, because we are still supposed to meet a certain time frame, I'm going to. Am I visible? Am I audible to everyone?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask my next question for Maya. Right, Maya. When we talked about, I think Nirmala has also mentioned about data demographics and asked Arjun about that. So if you want to just sort of quickly revisit the idea of digital archives as a public audit of governance and the role of curation in that, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, no, you asked this question, and I was thinking about it. Thanks for giving me a heads up, right?
Thanks.
Right. So obviously, there's a journey that we've been tracking since right to information, right? That is 2005. Now, in this sort of decade-plus journey of right to information, that right has become an assumption, and that right has been super activated because of digital, right? You go, you click, it's a 10 rupee digital payment, you can get your, answer, your query answered. So, I mean, there has been the understanding that the custodian of knowledge is always the state, and we are accessing the state to get that answer, right? Now, clearly, in terms of other media and other platforms that exist, does the right to information apply to them also? Right? Does it apply to the private sector equally? The whole idea that the curation of knowledge is to be done by the state, right, is itself an assumption that will be challenged, right, because of the shifting economy, the share of the private sector, who gets to, you know what I'm saying, actually control this show and all of that. But really, in terms of the cultural story, there is more emphasis now on the remixing and the user, right, than there is on the curator. Because the curator, anyway, by default, was the state, right, in terms of the static sort of archival model. And to think of it from the user point of view now is to say that that curation is like the upvoting curation. What is most salient, right? What is the sort of, you know what I'm saying, whether it's Twitter or something else, why is it the most salient? Maybe it's an echo effect, perhaps, but in some other sense, maybe it's also the most usable. So I want to sort of shift that conversation away from authority and curation back into this open field where we don't know what will happen, but clearly the user is driving the story now, and I think that's where we're coming in.
No, and what I find most fascinating
I
about
just
Maya, sorry, Nirmala. Yeah, please go
no,
ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
No, please
No,
go ahead. I've been asking enough
no,
questions. Sorry.
my only point was, I completely agree with Maya because, I think that when with this whole euphoria about digital, right, digital India, we also need to caution ourselves about the tyranny of the digital, right? And so the question is that when we say digital India, then, a lot of it seems to be about us as people becoming transparent to the state,
Yeah,
right? So what Maya is talking about would be something that would ensure that the state becomes more transparent to us too, right? So what is a parliamentarian voting on? What is your MP voting? What kind of bills are they voting on? So if we can create those kind of archives that will help us, hold
yeah, right.
democracy more accountable.
Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
no, I just want to my mind was less of a question, but I think all of the presentations and to sort of add in here that all of the presentations today show that digitality, while digital might have a specific signifier, the word digitality is always the realization of the digital in a specific context. So unless you
Exactly.
consider that context, then there is no understanding of the digital. And we have a couple of questions on the YouTube panel live
Yeah,
comments as well. Because what Maya has just talked about is how the archives can be that fluid site where you question the idea of archives as authority. Right? That's what she's brought in, right? That's the fundamental point. So I'm going to come back to these points. Hopefully, we'll try and wrap up by 7 p.m. IST. But before that, there are a lot of questions for Aditya on the panel, so I'm just going to quickly acknowledge that. So Aditya, I'm going to ask you. There's a question from Poonam who says, Dr. Deshbandhu, I'm a PhD student working on video games. I loved your paper on video games and the Indian Gamescape. I wanted to know more about tools or methods with which we can research mobile games which aren't treated as serious game text as the big console PC games in game studies.
Okay, I think to begin that inquiry, I think you first have to reject that assumption that serious game texts are texts made for PCs or consoles, be it in any format. If you look at what the Nintendo Switch, for example, is now doing, it's essentially taking a console and making it a mobile platform, isn't it? So, I mean, just speaking technology industry terms. And if you look at the success of the Switch, I mean, it's the only console which was unavailable because it completely sold out during COVID-19. Okay. Just speaking in the last 60 days, it completely makes us rethink what gaming is. So, Ms. Chaudhuri, I think one of the first things you could kind of do is to reject that notion, because that notion existed at a time when everybody tried to understand what is or who is the ideal gamer. Okay, and if you look at it, early studies from Dimitri Williams from USC Annenberg in 2006 and all kind of spoke about that stereotypical white teenager sitting in his basement playing the game. So the hardcore gamer definition comes from there. The more we break that definition, the better it is for us. So if you look at what's happening, especially with the freemium revolution in games, especially if you look at the success of Fortnite and PUBG and Call of Duty Mobile, and all the big games now coming to the mobile platform, I think that assumption does not hold anymore. The most money even the industry now makes comes from the mobile platform, and I'm only speaking from the broader mainstream understanding here. Okay, so that hardcore definition will change because the industry will want to change it revenue-wise. Now, speaking from a player point of view, this is something in my book also I kind of talk about in a couple of chapters. So one of my participants in this study, Prashant, told me, see, Aditya, Witcher 3 is considered to be a hardcore game, or Grand Theft Auto 5 is considered to be a hardcore game. because they put what 150 hours into the game playing it. I have put 3 years in Clash of Clans. Why on earth is it not hardcore? So the whole definition of hardcore, in terms of dedication, in terms of serious game pursuits, in terms of time, in terms of strategization, all of them are severely now challenged by the capabilities of the mobile platform. Okay, and especially with the hybridity it now allows, augmented reality experiences, mixed reality experiences. So I think the first step would be to reject that assumption, and then probably your work could be so much better, I guess.
Thank you, Aditya. I think that was very interesting to know. And I think for the terms of paucity of time, there's quite a few questions on the YouTube live comments. And while we would love to take all of them, due to I think I'm going to sort of collaborate a few questions and keep one last question for the entire panel. Some collaborative, as in overall questions, I want to take, and anyone in the panel is welcome to take that up. Is you know. Ramesh has asked about how to analyze any post-colonial novel that is mainly based on theory. Can we use DH there? I think these are questions about what instruments to use, and I think Dharti has plans to do workshops on specific instruments.
Yes.
While I don't like to use the word instruments, and the word instruments makes it sound like that DH is just tools. It's not. It's not tools. It's a convergent array of practices. If I have to quote Schnapp and Freshner, so I want to make that. There's a lovely question, I believe, from one of my students who talks about the idea of why do we, who I taught Orientalism to. So I'm very happy that she's got back to me on that. Aradhya has asked about why do we want to use the center periphery narrative or that vocabulary if we are rejecting all kinds of Anglo-American epistemes. And I believe Professor Arjun wants to take that question.
Yes, Dibya, this is very interesting. I mean, how can you mark a break from these concepts of center and periphery? As my work has also shown that the centers may be shifting in different contexts for different kind of fields. They're still going around a center. If you look at the classic situation that COVID has put us into, where we have we are forced into a kind of overdrive of digitality in our lives right now. But even then, we are so restricted by the development of infrastructure, right? Students, I just got an information that the biggest online course platform, NPTEL, one would think online course platform in India, NPTEL, which one would think would have boomed in this particular time when everybody is going online on courses and everything with the drive. They've actually had to postpone their course launch from July 20th till September for 3 months or 2 months, because there's a fall in registration, because the regular users do not have enough bandwidth or infrastructure support at whatever place they are residing in. What do you do even in the digital world? That these imbalances of development is something that we need to grapple with, and therefore some of these questions will continue to be very, very relevant.
Right. Great. And I think there's a question on possible job prospects, which is an interesting question, and I think a very important one. So, if any of you want to take up, right, what is the job prospects, and specifically the question asked is about corporate job prospects. And if any one of you wants to take that question up and answer that.
Well, I can take it.
Yes, Nirmala, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think, terms of job prospects for people who do an undergraduate or a graduate degree in digital humanities is, I'm assuming, the question, right?
I think so too.
Yeah. So while I don't want to limit it to only corporations, I do think that, the skills that you will acquire, both in terms of critical analysis and thinking, as well as some tooling and tweaking, right, will certainly prepare you for jobs, across media, across museums, archives, certainly academia and, higher studies, of course. But all of those things that, you would, well, let me put it like this, that, a degree in digital humanities is only going to give you skills that augment that you might have with a regular degree in any of the majors that we know about right now, right? So,
Sorry to quickly add on, Nirmal, I think I just want to reflect on the panel that we did a couple of years ago on multiple intelligences, multiple futures, right? So when we
yes,
talked of the idea of multiple intelligences, kind of, I think the question that comes about corporate jobs comes from the idea that humanities don't prepare you for corporate jobs because there is an
exactly.
inherent resistance to corporate jobs. But all across the world, and you take up any edition of Financial Times, which as a management school faculty I pick up on an average day, right? Every school talks of liberal arts as one of the key foundations of critical thinking. And we often forget that humanities is one of the bedrocks of critical thinking, because if we go into the older Humboldtian model of the university, liberal arts is not just the humanities. It's the seven subjects, which the quadrum and the trivium: mathematics, music, astronomy, art, grammar, logic, rhetoric. So I think this kind of a binary between both is a false binary. Personally, I believe that, and I think it's time that disciplines like digital humanities and fields like digital humanities break that traditional binary, right? So, having talked so much, I'm going to take the global south question, which is going to be the question that I'm going to conclude with. The wonderful question, and I'm going to throw it to all the panelists here. So, Professor Peter Francois has asked, I found the juxtaposition between DH in the Anglophone world and in India persuasive, as it highlights the lack of diversity in the former. My question is, how does or can dialogue between DH practitioners across the global south complicate the binary juxtaposition between DH in the Anglophone world and India? What needs to happen? What are the promises of such dialogue and the possible pitfalls? It's open for the panel.
Maya, you want to go first?
No.
Do you want me to go?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. And I think we can have an entire 1 hour panel on just that question. So, I think that is a kind of complicated discussion that we are trying to have at Dharti, right? So while we recognize that the registers of DH, in the global north may have more purchase, we know that that the work that we need to do as part of the DH Alliance in India has to be for for the local, for the projects here, and for outcomes that will benefit our students or our researchers and our so I think that's a dialogue we are trying to have. Of course, there is always there is always going to be conversations, and there is always going to be scholarship across borders, but that conversation has to be rooted in the cognizance of this disparity between access to resources in the global north as opposed to the global south. So I think I'll kind of I think that's where I would begin to think about that, and I welcome my other colleagues to to jump in.
Yes, please. Others, Maya, Mayurakshi, Chiranjoy, Arjun.
I think Chiranjoy will have a lot more to say about this, but I do agree about the infrastructure question, right? And the fact that we're often looking at open source tools and such, that of course, once that sort of community of sharing exists, everybody benefits. And of course, we are looking at developing our own indigenous solutions alongside that community, right? So, I mean, absolutely, there is a very different story playing out.
I also want to add, Dibya, that I think, we cannot be a space for sourcing data that are analyzed in different spaces without attention to the local or the very rooted nuances of where the data originates. right? And I think that's something both at the theoretical as well as the praxis level, as Maya just pointed out, in terms of open access, we have to really think very carefully about as digital humanists in India. One of the examples that I gave during my presentation was about data from the colonial times, right? Where we still today have to travel elsewhere to access that data. And even, well, we already know, as Mayurakshi has already pointed out, that migration itself is a privilege. Even for researchers, that travel also becomes privileged to very few institutions, within India too, right? But now we should not have that excuse. We should be very careful. That is why I think the National Digital Library project is so important, because not only is it multilingual, it is accessible to every college, every student across this country, irrespective of irrespective of the privilege of those institutions. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm just trying to think aloud.
Yeah.
If I come in quickly here,
Arjun
as
and
well
then Mayurakshi, please.
very quickly, as a literature scholar, one would know a little about the 1980s or so. We had most of the syllabi in India, the English literature would be English literature or American literature. It is only after that there is this questioning of that curriculum. I think with the coming of DH again, because the tools are so Anglo-centric, that we have to once again intervene in that respect. And so Dharti really has a task cut out before us.
No, and I absolutely agree on that. I think that's a very important point about the tools itself being Anglo-centric. When the data collection tool itself can only pick up YouTube comments and not comments from say Yuku, right? So then we have to talk about what that data collection does when you can't analyze certain forms of data. I want to go to Mayurakshi because she had her hand up, please.
No. I just wanted to build on what Nirmala talked about and what Arjun also talked about in a very concise way, is that what is the context under which that data is being produced, and can it be used as a DH data is the question. So I get questioned by students, by scholars all the time, do I have to learn Python to become a digital humanist?
Yes.
My answer is always, do you need Python to answer the research question that you're asking? So talking about tools, talking about anglophonic tools or whichever tools that we are using, the context under which that data is produced and why is that data produced, the question that is guiding the formation of that data is very, very important.
Yeah. And I also just want to add that is why we need our computer scientists along with us, right? Yeah, that it's because based on the tools that are developed, data automatically gets hierarchized, right? And so we need to. So I think it is the job of the digital humanist to ensure that to humanize the digital too, right?
And just to add on to Nirmala, and I know you did not mean it in that sense, but I think the computer scientist is not an add-on to the humanist. The computer scientist
no, not at all.
Yeah, is the condition of possibility.
I didn't mean like that.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't mean it like that at all. I'm sorry.
So the computer scientist must be the condition of possibility for the research question to exist. So that's the key point here, right? So I know we agree on that.
Because there's no harm having one more tool into your repertoire, right?
Of course. No, and I don't want you to be just the tool. I want you to be the conversationalist as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if we are okay, and I think it's almost time. We have just crossed 7. If it's okay for us to conclude at this point of time, and I think there's lots of people for us to thank. Obviously, as the moderator, I want to thank all my panelists who have been very kind and who have gone through multiple iterations of trying to play out with this platform to see whether it works. This is a learning process for us, and unlearning is very important. So I think we want to stress that unlearning also, right? Don't think of particular disciplines in one form, particular formats in one way. So we have unlearned. We are very grateful to all the people who have, DH is not doesn't come to India with Dharti. DH has been in this country, and that's one of our main arguments. DH has been there in this country for a very long time. It will be there for a very long time. If it doesn't look like the way you are acclimatized to look at it, then you need to change your spectacles, right? That's what we are claiming, right? So that's the main idea that we are trying to talk about, right? So with that, I would ask you to check out our other panels on the DH2020 page, and I would request everyone, we'll post this video on the Humanities Common Repository of the DH2020, and you are welcome to come there, post more questions. I apologize to everyone whose questions we could not deal with in detail, but I promise that Dharti will make this happen, and over over the next few months of next few weeks, we'll try and come back to you. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Dibya, for hosting. Yeah, thanks so much.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. So I'm going to conclude live stream with that.
Yes.
All right. Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.